this is taking the tradition on, and I'd like to say a big, warm, heartfelt thank you to the Arts Council of England. They helped me to find the money to digitise lots of reel-to-reel tapes that I inherited from my mentor, Duncan Williamson, who is an amazing Scottish traveller, storyteller and balladeer, and also had lots of help from crowdfunders who I'd also really like to say thank you to. And if you are one of my crowdfunders, which I think there's a few on here, I am currently working on an album, sort of a download, double album length worth of stuff specially for you. So anyway, so the Arts Council England have given me the time to just revisit my apprenticeship and the stories that I learned from Duncan, and to give me time to think about all the things that I learned from him and about the tradition generally, because I was 18 when I first met Duncan and now I'm 44, and I'm in a very different place in my life, and it's been really amazing revisiting all the things that I've learned from Duncan. And in this series, I get to talk to lots of other people about Scottish traveller's tradition, about Duncan, about storytelling, about all sorts of things. And one of the amazing people that I'm talking to, and my guest tonight, who I'm very, very, very excited to have, is Heather Yule. Hurrah! Whoop, 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 whoop. So welcome, Heather. For those of you who don't know Heather, Heather is a fabulous storyteller. She's also a harpist. But Heather grew up just constantly hearing stories. So your mother was Barbara McDermitt, and she was recording all sorts of people, and you've just grown up completely steeped in the tradition. Is that a fair description?
Yes, it is. I've been incredibly lucky for that. But yes, just since I can't even remember a time when there weren't traditional storytellers and being involved in all of that. So, yeah.
Did it feel incredibly lucky, or did it just feel like you were being dragged around from pillar to post and you'd be rather, going outside and playing with your mates?
Um, well, I think at times I did accuse my mother of not being a normal mother, whatever that meant, and that she just I used to. I think there were times that I did find her slightly embarrassing for all of that kind of thing. But generally, I think I did realize how lucky I was, and then later on, um, really realized just all the treasures that the gifts I'd been given and the possibilities and people that I'd met, which is quite incredible to look back on.
So, I mean, who tell us a little? I mean, I want it tonight to be about you, but will you tell us a little bit about your mother and what she was doing, kind of taking you to all these places and recording storytellers and singers?
Well, it kind of started before I was born, where she was involved in, as quite a few folk get involved in storytelling via theatre. You know, they've been, and she was working. She had a degree in children's theatre and children's literature, and she was working as a lecturer, and then got just interested in the idea of the tradition, of the traditional side of it, to actually, and understanding the differences between that and theatre. And she started. My mother being she's a very creative kind of person and has wonderful ways of just incorporating things she's interested in the way she works with people. So she started getting even her children's literature classes, the students to start doing storytelling, to go into primary schools. And she went into my primary school, my nursery school. And I still remember, I was just earlier today, suddenly was remembering that, I can remember doing, especially fables, with like the Lion and the Mouse, and running about as a 4-year-old, pretending to be, with all my classmates, pretending to be the mice in that story. And so it was story participation or story theatre. And then out of that, she started getting more and more interested in the whole traditions and folklore side of it, and then so came to Edinburgh University to start her PhD, and dragging me along with her to Edinburgh. And then, because the archives there, what she started getting very interested in was the travelling people of Scotland. And so we started going to visit, and various people, starting with Duncan Williamson when I was 7, That's the first time I met Duncan and Linda. And then, just lots of different people, and then folk festivals. So, everyone that, all the travellers that you can think of that were really kind of considered master storytellers. So you've got, Sheila Stewart, the Stewarts of Blair, Willie McPhee, and Betsy White was a great favourite. And then later on, well, not that far into her research, she realised that Stanley Robertson, she and Stanley Robertson, the Aberdonian storyteller and ballad singer, was somebody that they got on really well, and they decided that working relationship of her recording his stories would work. And so that was kind of, we started going up to Aberdeen. She would usually at the weekend she would take me, but sometimes she took me out of school too, because she thought, she couldn't get childcare. She thought, well, it's as important as anything else, as educational. It's an experience that she wanted to give me. So she would just whip me out of school and up on the train up north. It's good.
Did you, being there though, kind of influence the stories that he would tell?
Actually, it's interesting you said that, because I was looking through, because the collection that she made of Stanley's stories was, there's about 200, or more than that if you add all the memoirs, all the personal stories. And I was just looking through all the different categories of them, and there's some joke tales, and some of them are a wee bit you'd choose who you'd tell them to. And he did, I think it took a while before he would tell her some of these, and I think he didn't tell her very many. I think he probably had a huge repertoire, but it was the stories that were told amongst the men. And it was probably, she had to sort of say, well, look, I'm a folklorist, you can't think of me as a woman, but it still must have made it a bit tricky for him to actually start telling her some of those stories. There's just a few of them, but it's quite funny to come across them. And
there are definitely a whole raft of stories that Duncan wouldn't tell me because of my age and because I was a woman. And I do remember badgering him for this one song that I'd heard about the Tinker's Ball. And he finally went, fine, if you really want to hear it, I'll sing it to you, but you won't like it. And he started singing this awful song. And I went, actually, you're right. Just like that. That's beyond the pale for me. Yeah. And it is, still a very valid part of the tradition, but it wasn't.
From the sake of archiving, I suppose, it should be recorded. But yes, there's a couple of the stories as well that I think are just so un-PC. It's just, I would never want to tell them in public, but they are part of a time period and you have to just take them in that vein and not get upset by modern standards, I suppose.
No, and Stanley did have a good repertoire of terrible jokes. I mean, I did a couple of sort of late night extras for him, and I don't know how many people met Stanley or know what he was like. I mean, I met him sort of later in his life, so he was fairly elderly, but he was always very, very, very upright, and he was very, very influential in the church. He was a Mormon, and he didn't drink, and so that's how I sort of met him, as this kind of very Christian, upright, elderly man. And then I ended up, one of the first times I met him was first times I was hearing him telling stories was at Whitby, and we did this late night extra, and he got up and he told the rudest version of Jack and the Beanstalk I have ever heard. And it was like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So he would tell them when you were around, because I know I was really gutted because I took Chloe, my daughter, up, I was on my way to go and see Duncan when Duncan had his stroke, and I had been really looking forward to being on maternity leave and being able to rent a little cottage close to him, and to get that whole other side, and to get all the finger rhymes and all the children's stories that we'd never really swapped, because obviously we would tell adult stories. And I can imagine that taking you out to school, she would have a very different day with him than if you weren't there.
Well, I do remember that when we went up at the weekends, especially, we would be it would be Gabby and Nicole, who were Stanley's two daughters, and myself on the sofa, kind of, and then might some of the lads might come in and out, but a lot of them are much older, but they might be hanging about, and he would, you know, but he wouldn't tell any of the rude stories when we were about. But the thing is that the idea of what stories are appropriate, I mean, I find that quite difficult nowadays. I think a lot of us, struggle with that a bit in terms of thinking about the stories that you can tell in schools and in situations, because there's stories that I heard as a child that I absolutely loved, but I hesitate to tell them in schools because, and I know that one of the stories that anyone that knew Stanley will remember him telling is Eepily and Orangey, which of course is the story of well, they're half sisters, but one of them gets killed and put into the dinner to be fed to her father by the stepmother, and then the bones are gathered by the other sister, buried, and then it turns into a dove that goes and brings presents and luckily an axe to chop off the stepmother's head. But this story, there's another. It's obviously the same as one of the Grimm's ones. There's a Grimm story. So it's an international story, but in a lot of the collections, Scottish stories, it's a nursery tale. And getting muddled up now. Stanley was thought of it as a nursery tale. So I have a recording that my mother did of Stanley telling the story, but then, oh no, Nicole told it first. She was 5 years old and she told the whole story, and it's incredible because it's in really broad Aberdeenshire accent of a 5-year-old. And so it's really fast and it's really, really hard to understand but she tells it with such incredible. And in fact, the other month I was up at an event celebrating Stanley, and Nicole told that story at that event. And so that was brilliant to hear her as an adult, telling that story. But Stanley got in trouble, I think, in a couple of schools by telling that story because the teachers didn't think it was appropriate. So I think the thing is, what's considered appropriate has changed as well. And you wouldn't hesitate to tell certain stories, long stories as well. We think nowadays when we're telling that we have to, we're always being told, oh, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes is max. But some of these stories are they weren't that. If the 45-minute long stories are longer than that. I've got some of the on the recordings. There's one that's typewritten. It's 25 pages long, and it's an incredible story. Jack and the land of death, no death. And you just think, but where would you tell these stories now? Because there's not the platform for it anymore, really.
Is there not? Is there not the platform in Scotland?
Well, there is. You have to kind of make it happen. But quite often you're in situations where you're sharing a program with other storytellers, and then you want to make sure it's balanced. You don't want to steal time from others. You don't want to sort of hog the stage. And then also at times you sort of feel like people are actually saying to you, because partly because sometimes you're being fitted into things where people aren't used to stories, aren't used to storytelling and listening in that way. And so they sort of assume, that, okay, the storyteller will give her 10 minutes. I'm sure that'll be fine. But that's just, I suppose, maybe that's more things I've come across. And I have managed to tell longer ones. I've found ways and means of doing so.
I think that is a slight difference in England and Scotland. I think England it started, particularly the storytelling clubs. You go out for a concert and it'll quite often be 2 45-minute halves. And I know I've sort of been getting quite into do more of those longer sets, because I'm like you. I mean, there's the stories of Duncan, like Jack and the Black Thief of Slane and Jack and Beggar's Island, and it just, you need that time to kind of relax into a story and for people to come knowing that they're going to come and hear a long story and that there's chance to sort of get into the meat of it. And there's less of those, having more performers in one space. I mean, part of that is cost as well, you know. It's you can't afford to have several people when you can just have one, you know. But I would love to hear more about Stanley, really. So that's sort of your mother's relationship with him. But did you sort of have your own bond with him? Did you get to know him as an adult as well?
Not really, not enough, because I went off to do my music education, and I also I still am really, I think, quite shy about sort of badgering people and getting a chance to, you know, if it happens, then it's great. But I found that quite tricky. And I do feel that I missed out on, there's lots of people that I knew as a child that I didn't ever have a proper relationship later on. I mean, I did see Stanley at things and I did feel, you know, there was an affection there because he felt, and Duncan was the same, and Sheila Stewart and all of them, they were just, I always felt very welcomed by them, and like that, so that was fine. But I didn't actually spend a lot of time with Stanley, but I did see him at things and he was always very encouraging, incredibly encouraging and supportive of what I was doing, which was really nice.
So now you are kind of getting to know him in a different way, aren't you?
Well, I'm revisiting, and actually the thing that I think is most powerful about any of this kind of thing is that anyone that's been involved in storytelling or has started getting involved in it is the whole thing about listening. It's about about the voice, about how that voice communicates the story, so that you, as you're listening, can see the images of the story and create that whole what's going on in your own imagination. And Stanley was a powerful, powerful storyteller. The way that he spoke, the way that, and because I knew him and because I spent time listening to him as a storyteller, when I listen back now, it's wonderful because I can see him in front of me. I can see those eyes. He had the most incredible eyes when the scary bits were coming. You know, he just kind of, he had such a way about him, and he had such a cadence, just the way that he would sometimes be incredibly deliberate with the way he would pace something, and then suddenly it would just speed up, you know, so his dynamics and his range, and just the joy of listening to that again. It's but because have you done some transcribing of Duncan's stories?
I haven't done a lot of transcribing of Duncan. I have done quite a lot of transcribing of stories. With Duncan, less so, because Linda has already done a lot of the transcribing. So I suppose there's a lot of written stuff out there already for Duncan.
Yeah.
And this is more about me absolutely kind of doing the listening side of it. And I take in stories much better. And you get more when you get the voice as well as the words. When the words are flat on the page, I can hear his voice because I knew him. But listening to him is a whole different experience.
Well, this is the thing that's why I was asking you, because it's really frustrating when you're transcribing, because you can't get this sort of emphasis. So you've got something where you want to sort of, you can't type it the way it sounds. And so I think there is a place, you know, transcriptions and books where you can go and you can read the stories as they've been told. Mind you, that can also be problematic because of things like a dialect, you know, and I know that some people sometimes, when they actually put material out there, they sort of soften the dialect. Others, you know, the choice might be to keep the purity of the dialect, which in some cases might be difficult for uh, people to read. But it's a shame to strip that away because it's the character of that, and sometimes the words, you know, the words being used. Because even though, you know, my mum wasn't a traveller, and you know, Stanley still did use quite a few cant words, which is the traveller language, and I don't, you know, it's funny when you're listening to it because he'll start off where he's kind of anglicizing it quite a bit. You know, it's very much more of a proper Scottish accent or what have you. But as he gets into the story and gets more involved and more excited, the more Scots comes in, and the more it gets back into that rich Aberdonian language. So it's quite interesting to, as if he starts off thinking, right, I've got this. You know, somebody that's not from Aberdeen in front of me, so I should be a bit more proper, and then forgets completely. So I like that.
I did have the very, very first time that I ever saw Stanley Robertson, which is ridiculous, really, but was in America and at the National Festival in Tennessee. So, so I went all that way to find this incredible Scottish traveller. And I'd never been to such an enormous storytelling festival. I mean, you know, kind of the storytelling revival, as it's known in England, still kind of quite small. Festival at the Edge was in its second or third year, so we were doing quite well if we had maybe 250 people for the whole weekend. And there I was suddenly in a tent with like 2,000 people, right bang slap in the middle. Stanley gets up on the stage and he starts on this story, and it was just hilarious. I mean, he was just really funny from the beginning, and his pacing and his timing. But the entire tent was looking at him going, and the more he got into the story, I don't know if it was being excited about the story or if it was just kind of, you know, when you try and enunciate more clearly, and he was getting more, sitting more and more into his accent, and the more he tried to enunciate, the more Aberdonian he got. And people were just getting more and more and more lost. And I was just, because it was a really funny story, I mean, I was just crying with laughter. And I had nearly as many people looking at me as there were looking at Stanley. And the more and more people looking at me, the less and less I could control myself. I had tears running down my face. He thought it was hilarious, so he's carrying on. And it was just this bizarre thing of kind of like, you know, in 2,000 people, there was just these two that understood each other, with everybody else going, what's going on? And that was my first introduction to Stanley. And it wouldn't surprise me if he'd done it on purpose, because the real spark of mischief about him.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, I remember he went over to that part of the world a few times. Well, maybe I don't know how many times, but I do have some photographs of him playing the Highland pipes in a field in North Carolina, surrounded by mountain people with their dulcimers and their banjos and fiddles and things. But he got on really well with the local storytellers and what have you. But the thing that was interesting with that as well is that my mum's PhD was actually a comparative study with Ray Hicks, who I think you might have come across at that festival as well.
So he's sort of like the equivalent. He's the real, the Appalachian Jack teller, and is sort of he's sort of the equivalent tradition bearer in the States, and certainly in the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, so that was kind of, so sometimes we went over to the States, and I got dragged along as well to this part of the world, which was, again, it was like going into a totally different environment that you'd never get the experience to do normally. Because the Appalachian mountain people are very isolated, and it's changing, I'm sure now, but they still had, you know, folk that that had never, oh, I don't know, just, you know, that had memories going back to times when you still were well, some of them did have their double barrel shotguns on their porches so that they could shoot a snake or a rattlesnake for dinner or whatever. But they were just wonderful people. And as you drove up these hollers, which is their word for glen, but it's like there's no exit. You sort of kind of dead end. And we used to go up to see this old woman, Hattie Presnell, who was just amazing. and everyone would see you coming, and they would follow you up the glen, up the holler, and just block you in. And out would come all the fiddles and the everything, and the ceilidh basically would start. It was wonderful, but incredible poverty up there. And so I think, you know, when you see that, but that was the thing. You had Stanley Robertson, who is from the traveling community, who have, you know, anyone that, you know, we know that community, that culture has been victimized uh, for centuries. And the same happened in this community of people, these Appalachian mountain people. They're considered the lowest of the low, um, and yet they had, both of these cultures have such incredible riches in story and song and superstitions and beliefs and knowledge. I mean, incredible knowledge of plant and life, and, you know, things that have gotten lost. And yeah, so it was amazing to see these two different worlds, and to have that opportunity as a child and a teenager to sort of find out a bit more about it all.
So they were really comparing, like your mum was particularly looking at Jack stories, wasn't she? Because they're so rich in the Appalachian Mountains and in the traveller tradition. And now you're listening back to so many of those Jack stories. Why do you think Jack's so important?
Well, it's kind of, it's the everyman, I suppose. It's the kind of journey. I mean, the Jack tale is the hero's journey. It's the development, and actually that's something that Stanley talked a lot about with my mum, was that he felt he had, well, first of all, both Stanley and Ray associated themselves with the character of Jack. They felt that that was, you know, that character was themselves as much as, so that deep association with that. But also Stanley used to speak about the fact that there's the different stories of Jack, that you get Jack as the simple Jack, the immature Jack, and then you see him in different stages of his development as a character, up until you get to, you know, the trickster Jack, the Jack that got all the answers right there. And so that was kind of really important to Stanley as well, as seeing, is looking at that and seeing the different Jacks. You've got your silly Jacks, and you've got your Jacks that are just kind of bumbling about, the ones in the ashes, the one, you know. So there's all these different types of characters. But I did find it I really interesting recently, because I had to create a story for the Edinburgh Harp Festival for young musicians to perform with. And so I was asked to, I think I did 3 of them. And one of them I decided, because I love Jack tales. To me, they're really, really wonderful. I just, oh, I adore them. And I decided to structure it as a traditional Jack tale. And then I got a comment back through one of the other performers that after this was over, from a parent saying, "Oh, why did it have to be Jack? Why did it always? Could it not have been Jill or Jane or?" And because she meant the sort of feminine thing, you know, being the female, and why we always have to have a Jack. And I just didn't even think of it. I mean, I love stories, and I do tell a lot of stories that have to do with women, and I think, you know, that's really important to tell those stories. But I don't actually have a problem with Jack. But it was an interesting thing to be given that reaction from that person, because it did make me think about how other people might view that character. To me, it doesn't matter. It's a boy.
No, and it's coming out of those traditions as well, and we might be, you know, it's difficult, I think, to put our values onto a different society and a different time. And it was much more gender defined, and perhaps still is, but I mean, you know, everywhere, not just in traveller society. And I mean, one of the things that I really like about Jack tales is Jack's mother. And I think Jack's mother is an incredibly strong character, and she may have a bit part in it, but she's feisty. I mean, I've in all the stories, she's usually raised Jack all on her own. She's been this strong single parent who doesn't ask any help from anybody, who's usually, it's not been clear what's happened to Jack's dad, but he's either gone off to the wars and left her, or he's probably drunk himself to death and she's kicked him out, or she's been out of wedlock and she's gone and fought to keep that child with her, which is in the time of the stories itself, for her to have raised the child on her own is actually a massive thing for her to have done. And all the ways that she's found to keep body and soul together. And there's all just, whenever I listen to any of the Travellers Tell a Jack story, it's not very much there, but there's always just little hints of the things that she's had to do, of whether it's just getting bits of wool from the brambles and the bushes so that she can wash them and just make clothes for them. And, kind of, she's the one there originally who's got Jack strapped to her as a small child while she's digging the garden, while she's mending the roof, while she's doing all of the jobs of both the dad and the mum. It's kind of, she balances Jack. So yes, she's the one who's staying at home, but she's had the adventures to get Jack in the first place. And then she's such a strong character. That's me slightly going off on one. I've been thinking a lot about Jack Tales and Jack's mother. That's been one of the things that's been sort of going around in my head. And there are different stories of heroic girls and princesses, and who wear through their iron shoes, and it's not that they are represented.
Oh yeah, and actually Stanley did tell quite a few of those. He got a lot of those from his mother. He also, this, it was interesting, the stories that he got is from his mum had a different character to them than the ones he got from his dad. But there was a couple of things with the Jack Tales that I always think of that defines kind of like your Appalachian side and then the traveller side. And in the Appalachian side, it's, as time went on, these people had come from Europe originally, but then of course were isolated in their communities, and people kind of lost the idea of what a king and a queen meant. They didn't have, so the king and the queen in the Jack Tales in Appalachia are the farmer and his wife, because they were the wealthiest people, because most of the other people were tenant farmers. They were just surviving on a little patch of ground, I suppose, in a sense like crofters. But if you were actually a farmer that had lots of land, then you were wealthy in their eyes. You were the wealthiest people. So when you have Jack coming up to the king's house, it's the farmer. And he's sitting on the porch smoking his pipe, and the queen's in the kitchen with a penny on. So I always thought that was just great, is that idea of things transforming, because people's perceptions, they had no idea what a castle was. So they changed it. They made it something relevant to their environment. And then the thing about the Travellers Jack Tales that I love, that really I think defines a lot of the Traveller Jack Tales, is the complexity of them. They often have lots of different layers. There's some incredible stories that Stanley told, one which was about the land being destroyed by 7 plagues, and Jack, and all these plagues had different colors, and Jack had this whole very complicated thing to get to the wizard that he had to defeat to rid the land of these hideous plagues. There's all sorts of different things, and the devil always features quite a lot in the black arts. The lairds of the black arts always feature, but then also the riddles. And I was just thinking about one this week that I really like, which is basically it's like a traveller version of Jack the Giant Killer, which some people might know from, there's various versions, international versions of it. And so you've got this Jack character who's a bit of a scamp. He lies all the time. He exaggerates constantly. And so, like one day he takes a branch of a tree, and with one swipe, he takes off 3 daisies' heads. And so then he goes to the pub later and says, "Oh, with one swipe, I've just killed 3 giants. I've beheaded 3 giants." And, he's always saying things like this, and everyone's shaking their head and saying, "You're going to come to a sticky end, Jack, with all this lying." He just laughs. But then one day, one of the king's men hears him and goes and reports it to the king. And the king sends for Jack, and Jack thinks, right, this is it, I'm done for. And the king says to him, I need help. You know, you sound like you're such a clever man, you can do all these amazing things. So can you answer these 3 riddles? So it's because his daughter's been taken by someone, and the only way he'll get her back is by
Don't tell us
answering.
the answer, but tell us the riddles. Let's see if we can get them.
Yeah. Okay, so the first riddle is what is whiter than white? The second riddle is what is redder than red? And the third one is what is blacker than black?
Mm.
Mm. But what's good about the story, and I think again that's what is one of those traveler things, is that when he goes to the usual thing, he goes to the woods because he can't think about, you know, that first riddle is just like, oh, I'm so done for, and meets an old woman and helps her. And so um, she says, well, yeah, I've lived a long life. I know what the answer is, but I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to work it out, but I'll give you a clue. And so the clue is she tells him to go back and get the king's white shirt. And the next day when he goes to see the king, he's got to wear, this is the king's favorite shirt. He's to wear it. And Jack's thinking, oh, how's that going to help? How's that going to help? So I don't know, did anyone have an answer for the what's whiter than white?
Yeah, we've got a couple. So Shane is saying milk, blood and coal. And Kath is saying snow, blood and coal.
Right. Well, the first one is that when he goes to the king says, that's my shirt you're wearing, Jack, immediately, because of course he's a liar. He says, no, it's not your shirt. The king says, but yes, it is my shirt. And then just in that instant, Jack knows the answer to the riddle. Truth is whiter than white. And so that's the answer to the first one. The second one, it's what is redder than red, is actually embarrassment. And that's quite a good one because he has to nick the red drawers that the king likes to wear. He has to go into the bedroom and steal them. And so the next day when he goes into the chamber, the king's running about madly, absolutely naked, desperate to find his red trousers. And everyone's laughing at him. So he's embarrassed. And so it gets the answer with that. And then the last one, the old woman refuses to give him any clue. She says, you've got to work this one out yourself. And he's in despair. And as he goes back to the castle, he sees a dead crow on the ground. So he picks up the crow thinking, well, that's something at least. And it's black, and it's really black. But when he gets to the castle and comes into the main room where the king is, it's filled with courtiers. And he's standing there waiting, and he notices a young widow dressed in black from head to foot. And so then he suddenly thinks, it must be death. Death is blacker than black. And that's the answer. Those are the answers that are correct. So I know there's loads of answers you can have for any of those, but that's the one that that's what Stanley had for that one. And I really like the idea of, you know, the helper figure in stories. You know, as storytellers, we know this figure. It could be a man, a woman, or an animal. They're so vital. They're so important, and there's that incredible symbolism that you can get from all of that. But it's really interesting when you've got this where, yes, I'll help you, but you also have to help yourself. You know, I'm not going to just spoon feed this to you. You have to learn. You have to, and I think that's really interesting. Really,
Well,
really good.
you can tell me that I'm wrong because you knew Stanley much better than me. But I mean, certainly from Duncan and from the little bit that I knew of Stanley, that's totally the traveller ethos about you know, you have to help yourself. All of the stuff is there, but you have to help yourself, and that's as part of their religion. I mean, they tend to be Christian, but there's this deep love of nature, and certainly Stanley would talk about Mother Nature as a goddess, and she was just a really important part. And it would tend to be in the stories that I heard him tell that were like that. You would get these Jack stories, and he would have the helper, but there it would usually be female, and it would almost be like a representative of Mother Nature going, I've got everything that you need, but you have to earn it, you have to treat me with respect, you have to live the right way, and then I'll help you. And so she would be the counterbalance, this mother nature and the earth and this sort of everything that's there that's needed. And then you've got the laird of the black arts, who's the devil figure, but he's also the one who is rich, and he's the one that's kind of that consumerism, and the one that's taking, and he's rich because by becoming rich he is making other people poor. And
Yeah.
that's the black art. That's the heart of the black art, is that I'm going to take away from you.
Yeah.
And that's the real devilishness of it.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be for me at the center of everything that Stanley did. But I mean, yeah, you could probably tell me more about that.
Well, no, and that connects with what I was saying earlier about the hero's journey, is that you've got this, that these stories are a teaching tool, if you will, as well as entertainment. It was education. It was a way of, if you treat people right, we've all got, those stories where you've got, it could be the lassies, about the youngest daughter going out and the older sister's not doing right by a wee bird or an old woman. And the same with the Jack Tales. You might have the two older brothers going out and just not sharing their bit of bannock, and thus ending up in the dungeon or with their heads chopped off. And it is that thing of, these have some morals, but the morals are kind of woven in, and they're not kind of like hitting you over the head with it. So, but you still learn something from that, is the idea. Uh, and landscape, what you're saying about landscape, I think is really important as well, isn't it? That how vital the land, and Stanley used to take people to the Alder Road along Fannin. I think he took you there once, I believe, and he always had stories that he preferred to tell when he was there, because that was the place that meant so much to him. It was kind of like the heart of his sort of family traditions. They used to go there every summer and camp on the Alder Road, and the memories, and even later on when you couldn't camp because it was, the police had closed the road long ago, he used to take all his children, spent the summer holidays there. They'd rent a cottage up the road, and there was, but there were stories that have to be told in certain places, and that's quite amazing, actually.
Absolutely. And I think and I think he sort of came to a point where he would lecture the morals a little bit, because he kind of got to the point of that maybe non-travelers weren't really listening properly. I was like, you're not really getting this, so I'm just going to spell out the end for you, because I've only got so much time left to pass these stories on, and I want you to understand what they're actually about. And certainly, I mean, the big story, I suppose, one of the other story that he's really well known for. Does everybody know the story of Old Croovy? Do lots of people know that story?
I know
see people are right,
but I don't know if anyone. No.
Cass says no. So it used to be online, and I can't find him telling it now, which is because I was looking at, I was going to try and get a link that I could post up for people to see Stanley telling Old Croovy, and we've been talking about him, and one of the brilliant things about him being recorded is I put right at the beginning of the chat a link to the School of Scottish Studies archive, and they've got this amazing site, the Kist of Riches, which I cannot pronounce in Gaelic. I'm really sorry. It's Toba and Dulcis. So you can have a look, and there's lots of Stanley telling, but there's one particular story, Old Croovy. Very briefly, it's about it's on the Lunfannon Road, and there's an oak grove, and the king of the oak grove is Old Croovy, this huge great oak. And again, you've got the king of the black arts, you've got Jack. Jack is a wee boy when he has to work for the laird of the black arts to pay the rent for his mother's cottage, and he has to sit and look after the sheep from being 5 years old, and his main job is just to sit there and cry wolf if there's a wolf. And he's quite frightened about this at the beginning, doesn't want to see a wolf, but he sits there and he gets bored. All he has to do is sit under Old Croovy, and eventually he learns the sound of the birds, the language of the birds. And the day comes, the midsummer, when all of the trees go down the hillside to wash their roots in the stream and to dance, and Stanley would say to mate as well. And that night, you know, all the birds are going crazy in the daytime. They're going, you know, all our nests are going to get shaken out. Everybody's got to leave. So it ends up that both Jack and the laird, I'm not doing justice to this story because we're doing the bones. It's a fantastic story, but they're both waiting above the oak trees, waiting for them to go dance, because in the birth spot of each of those trees is the tree's treasure. And if you go, you can take a little bit of the treasure. And Jack's mum said, you know, just get a little bit and it'll set you up for life. So of course, Jack just takes a couple, and the laird takes, you know, masses. But every time you pick up a jewel, you go deeper and deeper and deeper down. So the laird is just like at the bottom of an enormous pit, and Jack's going, send up the jewels and then I'll get you up afterwards. But my rope ladder that my mum's made for me out of all the bits of wool that I got off all the brambles isn't going to manage to carry both of you. And the laird's going, I'm not going to fall for that. You'll take the jewels and you won't get me up. Anyway, faffs about for long enough that, of course, old Creevy comes back, settles down on top of the laird, who becomes fertilizer for the next 50 years. Old Creevy looks very happy with himself. There's a better laird after that. Jack is able to marry Mary because he didn't have enough money to marry her earlier. There was a point to why I was telling you this story. Now, I've got two into Old Creevy. But sort of stories like that's one of the stories from the Lunfannon Road, and that's the story that he told me when he took me there, and it would have been completely different to have heard that story anywhere else. We sat underneath the branches of Old Creevy. There was bird song all around us. We had Dairy Lee sandwiches that Stanley had made and brought. And but at the end, this is it. It's that thing of actually just making sure that people understood, you know, kind of Mother Nature is here. Mother Nature will give us what we need. Don't take too much of the treasure. When you take it all, then you'll end up in a deep pit and you won't be able to get out. Nature will survive and we won't. And he was sort of, I think towards the end of his life was really kind of, I want you to get these morals because it doesn't feel like people are listening. There's small group of people who have these stories, who understand, who can live with the land, and the rest of the world isn't getting it. And he was really trying to push it out there. And certainly the way that he talked about Mother Nature, I mean, he sort of then talked to us quite a long time about Mother Nature and about the importance of her as a mother goddess, as the earth, which just was, it was a very, I mean, I'd love you to say more about this, because he was so strongly religious. So he's, you know, quite, I don't know what the name is for the position that he had in the Mormon church, but he was a preacher.
Elder. He was an elder.
Yeah.
Elder.
But so he's an elder, but he also had a very shamanistic side to him. And there was this whole layer of mysticism that he was able to completely happily balance at the same time. And I think all the travellers that I've met have got a very strong Christian faith, but they've also got this mysticism to them as well, and the belief in nature. And I don't. Did you experience? Did you have any of those sort of experiences with Stanley?
I talked a lot about it because I mean that was actually part of the. You know, my mum and Stanley got on quite well because she, even though she wasn't going to church all the time, she came from a very, you know, a very strong faith from her family, and she was really interested in theology and discussing it, and so was Stanley. So when they sort of, after they had talked about stories and things, they would sometimes just be talking about theology and their belief systems, that and it was really interesting. It could be fascinating. They got into these discussions, but what was amazing with Stanley is seeing the strength of his faith, but then on the other side, how his beliefs, that, you know, he was never going to let go of what his strong beliefs in the supernatural, and you know, the experiences that he and his family had with the other side, if you will, and he didn't see a problem with that. You know, he didn't ever see them clashing, which you think quite often, you know, they're very separate. You know, if you believe in ghosts and kelpies and all sorts of things like that, then you're over here somewhere, and if otherwise you're in the church, you just, they don't think of that as being together. But he was also, and I mean the traveler culture, things like, when you were talking, I was just thinking about the pearl fishing and how, especially up Aberdeenshire, there's lots of pearl fishing with those amazing rivers up there, and but they knew how to fish the river. They knew how to take to get something that they could sell, and then they they knew what to leave so that there was more, that they weren't stripping the place. And I think that's the thing, is all these, they had, all of these values have been undermined and lost, and we need to get back to that place, but where we're treating nature with a bit more respect. Um, but and that tree, he that you're speaking of on the old road, he also spoke of that as the tree of life, which is that, that's that very strong, powerful Celtic symbol, the tree of life. And he felt that tree there, that was the tree of life. Um, and it was amazing to listen to him speaking about the road and about things like that. Just incredible man he was.
I think I'm just diverging just slightly because of the chat. So there's a link now to that story on the chat. So thank you ever so much, Fiona. That's brilliant. Yes, we can save the links. I will save the chat, but and I will put links to the Kist of Riches and to Old Creevy and any of the links that come up. I'll put them onto my Facebook page so that you will be able to get them afterwards. And yeah, I've lost my train of thought having gone to that, but no, it's gone.
I was going to say is actually, I find this really interesting because so many people I associate that story with Stanley, but he never told that story to my mum. When she was recording, it was very early on when he'd already, he had been, especially maybe ballads singing, because of course he's the nephew of Stanley Robertson, the well-known, amazing ballad singer, and so he had that. He was in the folk clubs. He had been doing a bit of storytelling. He had been recorded tiny bit from the school. But my mother was the first person that really worked with him from the School of Scottish Studies, and so that was in 1979 to 1985. That archive is. So it's kind of the early days of him remembering all these stories, and he would sometimes just phone up and say, "Oh, I've remembered another Jack Tale, or I've remembered something else," and she would get her recording equipment and get into the train, and up north she'd go. But that wasn't one that he told her, which is, I find, really interesting.
It's really funny, and it is a Jack Tale as well. So,
of course, yeah.
but again, it's like you're saying with the landscape, though, isn't it? And I think the thing is, I mean, certainly before I knew anything about travellers, I mean, I hadn't really thought a lot about them before I met Duncan at all. But I think there is this thing of thinking that travellers travel in straight lines, and of course that's not the case. It's not like you travel in a straight line and you can just it doesn't matter then to a certain extent what you do behind you. Travellers travel in circles, and so you're always coming back to the same places. So it really matters how you leave a place and how you've treated it as to what you find when you come back the next year. But also it's then stories, like you were saying, become so associated with bits of the landscape. And I think sort of the song lines in Australia have become quite famous now, and people sort of walking those and telling the stories of those bits of the land. But that is how our minds, I think, are mapped. And I think most traditional cultures, that's a really big way of how to remember stories, because then different stories are associated with different bits of the landscape, and so that the land is supporting you and it's telling you the stories back again. And so that and as well as the stories being about the land and about the relationship that you have with the landscape is also literally kind of telling you some of those stories, because it becomes mapped onto your brain, and that's a much easier way to remember. It's very difficult to just sit in an armchair and to go through like 1,000 stories and remember all the stories that you have. You have to have a method of how to do that, and so you tell certain stories at certain times of year and in certain seasons and in certain places, and the more years go by, then the more that those are cemented. Sorry?
Oh, stories that want to be told. Have you get that, or one just pops into your head and it's like, oh, I've not told that for years, but it wants to be told, so it has to be told. But the other thing, I just because I know time's running out, and it just one thing that I really think is important, that not just Stanley, but Duncan and Betsy White and all these people really gave besides these wonderful stories and their friendship and what have you, one of the things was that was a gift was understanding a bit more about legacy, about the traditions and the we talk a lot in Scotland about when we're talking about traditional materials and traditional music and story, is the carrying stream, the image of the stream coming down from the mountain, that things cut, little burns are coming into it from different directions, leaves fall in, bits of twigs. There's kind of like, but the original stream is there. It's just that things have come into it, and it's still the same stream, but it's got all these other things that have been added in. But it's vital that it came from the mountaintop in the first place. And the thing is understanding where the stories come from, respecting that, who you've gotten them from, and not forgetting and not kind of taking these for granted. And I think it's the same. I feel that way also with my harp music. That I think it's really important to feel like I know who my teacher was and who my teacher's teacher, and etc. etc. And when I come across a pupil that is like a student of one of my ex-pupils, it's like, wow, that's so brilliant. It's like it's still carrying on. And I think that, their memories, their ability, Stanley, there's one time where he recorded his whole family tree, and it took two sides of a reel-to-reel, one of these big reel-to-reel things for one side of his family. And luckily the other side wasn't quite so long, because there was some crossovers. But he knew them all in his head. These are people going back generations. He never met them, but he knew them. They were his people. They were his ancestors, and they were the people he got his stories and songs were passed down through. And that to me is I'm very passionate about that. I think, we have to keep that in mind as tradition bearers, as the next generation, as to pass on to the next, is to try and keep that feeling of that legacy, and how important and how exciting and wonderful that is.
I couldn't agree more. And we are pretty much out of time. We're officially out of time, but well, you don't have to stay. So we can say, if you need to go and do something else, it is now 9 o'clock. But I did promise people that if they wanted to ask you some questions at the end, they could. So if you want to find the Q&A at the bottom, if you've got some questions that you particularly have a burning desire to ask Heather, then please do put them up. But I just want to really agree about how important that legacy is, and the huge generosity that the Scottish travelling people have had, and particularly this last generation of Sheila Stewart and Stanley Robertson and Betsy White and Duncan Williamson, of sharing those stories, which are just such a wonderful resource on so many levels. And it's something that we didn't manage to get onto talking to you about tonight, is a very good thing about actually how collecting and archiving has changed, and how much more the contributors are being valued, because there was the time when it was very much about the academics, and all the glory went to the people who had discovered, found these sources, and the sources would kind of be pumped dry, and the academic would take all of the glory. And that has really changed, which is a very marvelous thing, because these tradition bearers who carry the tradition are incredible. So I don't think, I'm just looking to see, I don't think there are any questions on the Q&A. I'm having a little look. So Also, Norman's recommending a book about the connection of story and landscape. So if this is your land, then when are your stories, by Ted Chamberlain. So that's, I don't know that one. So thank you for that. I'll be really interested to have a look. Mike Rust is asking, did Stanley tell you the story about the snakes and adders? This may be the same story that I was asking you about, Heather. Mike, are you talking about the snake woman and the snake people? I'm going to have a little look at the other questions. So Teresa saying thank you so much. Alison Bell saying thank you so much. Thank you very much for being here, for listening and being part of the conversation. Mike is saying yes, it is the story about the snake people that I was
No, he didn't, but there was one. There was a great Jack tale with he liked like this idea of shades, like that you could create the black arts person could create like copies of themselves to cause trouble. And so there's Jack and the Seven Giants, which is actually only one giant, but he's got like six versions of him. And the way, so he manages to kill six of the, or seven giants. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's left with one giant, who's the real giant. And he has to, a challenge. And Jack knows that he can juggle. He's a very good juggler. So he gets 7 wee piggy jars, which is just like wee jars with stoppers. And he puts adders in each one. And then takes these jars to juggle with them at the giant. And the giant then cheats and just tries to imprison him. And so Jack breaks the jars and all the adders bite the giant and poison him. So he manages to rescue the princess by getting the giant agrees to make it all good if the antidote is given to him. So that was the only one I could think of with adders, but it's a great story.
Fantastic story, and I haven't heard that at all. I love the idea of, I mean, because they would be pretty knocked, I would imagine, the adders, after being juggled with. I mean, they're not going to be happy.
Yeah, I would be mad if I was putting a wee jar again. Anyway, that was just one of.
So Shane, it's more of a comment than a question, he's saying, but he says he finds it in Icelandic tales, the farmers are the kings and queens and the black arts are very prevalent.
I've spent some time in a wee bit of time with some storytellers in Iceland, and I sort of felt like they're the way their society is designed. It's not got the sort of class systems that we do and have in the UK. It's really interesting to talk about politics and things with them, because it's a very different view. So I can imagine that would be the case. Oh.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, you know, I think kings and queens in stories tend to be maybe not quite so rich, and you know, they're obviously they're a lot more common, aren't they? So, but Scotland does have a lot of castles. Just have a lot of castles.
Yeah.
So we haven't got any more questions, but what I am going to do is I am going to save the chat so that I will have all of the links, and I will put those up on my Facebook page, which is just Amy Douglas Storyteller, so you can come and find them there. This will be streamed to YouTube, so if there was something you missed that Heather said and you went, oh, I just want to go back and find out a bit more about that story or that thing that she said, then it will be at the Taking the Tradition on YouTube channel. And an hour's just never long enough. But thank you so much, Heather, for all of your memories, for your stories, for your comments, and just for your enthusiasm and your passion for the stories. And I've still got a head full of questions that I would like to ask you, but maybe we'll just have to have another one sometime. Yeah. So I will be here every Tuesday at 8 p.m. And I haven't got my guest confirmed for next week. I do have plans, but we have to confirm some dates and some people. But I'll be here at 8 p.m. I'll be letting people know who my guest is next week. And just to say thank you so much to Heather. You can find Heather on Facebook, Heather Yule Harp Stories. And of course, the big thing that you're working on that we never really properly talked about is 2 books of Stanley Robertson stories and about your mother's working relationship with him. So you're transcribing all of these wonderful tales and memories. We don't have a release date, but I will let everybody know when it finally happens.
In the future, but something to look out for.
Well, I think a crowdfunding campaign could be in the offing. I think that would be a really good idea, and I would certainly love to pay for my book in advance to help that project happen. So if you do get that off the ground, then we will pass that on as well. So thank you so much for your company, and just a big hurrah! Well done, well done. And thank you very much everybody for coming. So thank you very much to Candice and to Kaz and Kath Edwards, Kath Little, Emmett, Fiona, Katie, Mark, Mike, Monologue, John is here. John, lovely to see you. Norman, Russ, Shane, Teresa. It's just been delightful to have all of your company tonight. And that for tonight is the end of Taking the Tradition On.
Thank you very much.